Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, we're all good.
Okay.
That's okay, I don't need it. This sponsor pretty dirty.
O una una I ta hala me ta lehua. He hale lehua no ia na tano e. Ta uno ia ia no I nei. E li ane ho I o tahi ima. Ah hiti mai no hau. Ah hiti puno me te aloha. Alohe. 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 Mai Makou. My name's Kamana Beamer. I'm a kupa here of Hawaii Island, resident of Waimea. I'm a father. I'm a professor at the University of Hawaii Manoa, between School of Law and School of Hawaiian Knowledge. Yeah, it's really a privilege to be able to have a chance to talk story here at Puʻuhuluhulu University, founded by some of our students, and a really great opportunity to talk story in the malu of Mauna Kea and Puʻuhuluhulu. Some of my ohanas here, so I want to mahalo my wahine kili'i for helping support me. My dad and my mom are here. Uncle Calvin Ho, my mentors, Auntie Sarah, Uncle Ed, or Auntie Sarah. I don't see Auntie Sarah, but Uncle Ed. So mahalo. I've been asked to talk a little bit about some of my work and my research. I want to start with, if there's one thing that you kind of leave with from this talk is really the incredible sophistication of the land tenure system that our kupuna set up here in all of Hawaii. And it's incredibly, it's almost easy to overlook because it's so amazing, it's so fascinating, it's so ancient. I'm going to talk a little bit about that system and how it was developed over time, and then I'm going to talk about really it was that system and that structure that allowed our ʻiwi to create, the first non-colonized, non-European, independent sovereign state in the world, which is the Hawaiian Kingdom. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at right now with Mauna Kea. But let me start with that. So what we do know about the origins of our land tenure system is they were developed almost simultaneously on different islands. So as our people were here, as our ancestors were here, the lands became more and more filled up with people. Likely most of our kupuna at first, we lived in the wet valleys, right, next to streams, where we could farm kalo, easy for bait, easy for catch fish. As the population started to increase and grow, we started to migrate to other parts of the islands. And for instance, here on Hawaii Island, we know a small percent of Hawaii Island you can actually farm wetland kalo. It's only about 3% of the land. Really, you're talking about Waipio, right, Pololu, some of North Kohala, and some of Hilo, maybe with some spring-fed systems. So we spread out, and our kupuna started to develop these other really complex agricultural systems, learning what they knew about lo'i and ecosystems health and services. And so we developed these dry land field systems. If anybody's been, Kohala, South Kohala area, Kona, Ka'u, vast, large, huge swaths of land that our kupuna utilize a different style of agriculture to provide food, different than lo'i. Different place, different ecosystem, different function, but our kupuna were masters of this agricultural system. And so the land tenure system itself kind of grew out of that, out of our kupuna's ingenious ways and desires to feed ourselves and to increase the population as the population was growing. We do know that on Kauai, ali'i named Mano Kalanipo. Many of us may have heard his name in songs, right? He's famed on Kauai for really refining and developing this ahupua'a land tenure system and solidifying boundaries. Nearly around that same time was another chief on Oahu. His name was Mo'elikukahi, very famous ali'i. We had an auntie from Kukaniloko speak earlier today. Mo'elikukahi is famous for being from that area, one of the low chiefs. On Maui, we had Kaka'analeo. He establishes a lot of the palena there on Maui and Maui Nui. And then here on Hawaii Island, probably after, it's really famed by the ali'i Umiali Loa. Is known for solidifying all the boundaries here on Hawaii Island. And I want to take a step back for a second. So all the chiefs that I named to you, these people lived probably roughly 15 to 17 generations prior to the arrival of Cook in Hawaii. Okay? So think about that for a second. The land tenure system that was set up, the ahupua'a that we still know and live in and exist today, were set up about 15 to 17 generations prior to Cook. We're talking about really ancient, really old knowledge. Yeah? In many ways, aloha to all of our indigenous cousins in other places in the world. And in many ways, a lot of their land tenure systems, because of colonization, they were carved over, right? A lot of places lost their traditional place names. For instance, if I was to ask anyone here know what's the traditional place name of New York?
New Amsterdam.
New Amsterdam, right? Yeah, when it was colonized by the Dutch for a while, it was New Amsterdam. But what was it originally before that? Pequot, right? It could be, yeah, the Pequot nation. There's several nations that were in the area. But just immediately asking that question, right, you can see how people's territory had been changed and mapped over time by colonizers, right? What's really unique about us here in Hawaii is that we still have that land tenure system. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So we've all heard of the ahupua'a system probably here. I want to say almost guaranteed. And there's some things that we know about it. They're not, sometimes maybe in elementary school we learned was one pie-shaped wedge of land, right? And oftentimes it does run Makou to Makai. Sometimes you hear when ahupua'a is also in watershed, maybe if you took science classes. And it turns out none of those things are entirely true. They're all partly true. Ahupua'a are incredibly diverse. They range in size and shape. When we try to define it in a paper, we call them culturally appropriate, ecologically aligned, self-sufficient units with diverse access to resources. And the reason we call them that is because some areas like on Oahu, Uncle Calvin's home aina, Hakipu'u, is like one watershed. It's actually bound by topographical features of a watershed. It collects the water, right? Some areas like maybe Waiahole might look like one watershed. But actually our boundaries and our systems are way more complex than that. Some ahupua'a are tiny little slivers. And in fact, if I was able to take you on Google Maps or Google Earth like I do in my classroom, but maybe we use the Kānaka lens right now and we fly over Mauna Kea and we look across the Hamakua coast, there's a tiny little sliver of an ahupua'a that runs to the shore there. And it's actually near a place called Kukai'ao. You know where Get Donna's cookies? If you drive down the road, not far from there is an ahupua'a named Ka'ohe. And that ahupua'a is a tiny little sliver on the Hamakua side. It climbs up the slopes of Mauna Kea and it turns into this giant engulfing ahupua'a. It takes all of the summit of Mauna Kea. It stretches all the way across here, across Puʻuhuluhulu, and it meets one of a small number of ahupua'a on the tip of Mauna Loa, on the base. Yeah, you get Keauhou 2 comes up from Kona, you get Kahuku on Ka'u side, Humu'ula on Hilo side, and they meet on the tip of Mauna Loa. While there's literally, there's over 900 ahupua'a on Hawaii Island alone, okay? So the coasts are like just these huge swaths that many of them do run Makou to Makai, okay? But in North Kohala and in South Kohala, up in the Kohala Mountains, you actually have ahupua'a that are landlocked. Some of them don't extend Makou to Makai. And so, as we've been learning and understanding more about ahupua'a, we're realizing, yeah, it's much more complex than one pie-shaped wedge of land. And in fact, not all of them were self-sufficient communities. What was really happening was that our kupuna were maximizing resource production in every place they could. And they was trading stuff, and they was sharing stuff, even across island. There's stories about Kaikili asking Keawe Mauhili if he can harvest some of the koa trees to make canoes here on Hawaii Island. So even in between island, we was exchanging things. Why this is incredibly important is because it shows the sophistication of the land tenure system that our kupuna had. Yeah, we wasn't people just living in little nooks and crannies, gathering stuff. And that's beautiful, to live in one nook and cranny and gather stuff. But we was also maximizing production, boosting the limits of what we could provide in terms of ecosystems, health, and services. And we know for a fact, actually, this has been proven through archaeology today, that on every single island today, other than Oahu, okay, was more populated in the time of Umi, Aliloa, and Mailikukahi than it is today. So as busy as Hawaii Island is, all of our people, we sit in traffic, but we still fed more people, really, by the abundance of the resources that we had here than we do today. With all of our tools and technologies, with my great iPhone, with my Twitter feed, right? Everything we have, we are growing scales of order less food than our kupuna were when they had tools, right, that was made out of stone and rope made out of the forest. So this is an incredible, powerful system that our kupuna set up here in Hawaii. I authored a paper with one of my grad students. We tried to, the number doesn't count that much, so don't worry too much, but we wanted to get a sense how much ahupua'a were there in Hawaii in the period of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Okay, so we tried to survey all the paper resources we could get, all the archival resources we could get, and we counted 1,825 ahupua'a throughout all of Hawaii. All super different, diverse, rich, right? You get some places on Maui, they jump all across the ocean, claim Koho'olave. Lanai has ahupua'a that actually extend all the way from the ocean, up the mountain, all the way to the other side to the ocean. So this really, really complex land tenure system, 15 to 17 generations prior to Cook. Totally amazing. And in fact, to me, I tell my students, we often underestimate that we still know these names today. It's actually a giant miracle to me, right? You ask many, even hula halal, right? Traditions that have kept our traditions for generations. You know, you have a hard time probably finding ike that's as old as our ahupua'a system, 50 to 70 generations prior to Cook. Super, super old. And it's incredible because we still get them today, right? And we still know our place names, whether you're on Oahu, in Waimanalo, in Makaha, Pakipu'u, right? You're in Wailua, Kauai, wherever you are, we still associate with our kupuna's ahupua'a. Why is that? And there's a whole number of reasons. One reason is the strength and the resilience of our people, of our kupuna. The fact that we would never yield and give up our traditional understandings, our traditional worldviews, our ike, right? So that's one key reason, is we are fighters. And if anyone doubts that, they've been reminded as a result of our efforts here today. The second reason why we still have our ahupua'a is to me is also a really incredible story. So during the period of the Hawaiian Kingdom, this story actually happens on the slopes again of Mauna Kea. Lata Kapuaiwa, he's a prince at this point. Everyone know who Lata Kapuaiwa is. He becomes Kamehameha the fifth eventually. Yeah, his dad was Mataio Kekuanao'a. He was a grandson of Kamehameha. And Lata's he's a prince at this period. He's actually on on a, some people say on a horse, some people say on a mule, but he's riding on the back of one ungulate from Waimea, and he's trying to get to Hilo Courthouse, okay? And as he's going across the Hamakua coast, he looks up and he's just amazed at the beauty of Mauna Kea, right? The expanseness of Mauna Kea, right? How this giant swath of Aina that he's going through. And he starts to think about, okay, the land tenure, how are we gonna preserve our ahupua'a and our boundaries? Because the ahupua'a that go up the slopes of Mauna Kea, they don't look like Hakipu'u on Oahu. They don't look like Waipa on Kauai, that are really defined by mountains and ridges, yeah? The boundaries are different. And so Lata gets this idea, hey, we're gonna start this mapping system called the Boundary Commission, okay? And he writes up a draft of this law, and it actually requires surveyors. They cannot just come in and make any kind, right? And draw one map and create one name. They actually have to go out and meet with kupa of the place and try to learn the traditional boundaries and have hearings. And so there's actual testimonies now that you can go and look at about traditional ahupua'a boundaries and why people knew them. And so because of Lata's leadership in many ways, a lot of our ahupua'a boundaries were preserved through this thing called the Boundary Commission. But Lata Kapuaiwa wasn't alone in this kind of visionary styles of leadership and in finding ways to appropriate technology. So it's not that, you know, definitely our kupuna learned how to create topographical maps, right? They learned them at Lahaina Luna. They learned them from foreigners. They learned them from Haole. But they took the maps and they made them Hawaiian. They made something new, yeah? So the metaphor that I use in a lot of my work is called this ʻŌiwi agency, right? Is that us as a living culture, as a living people, right? Who is to tell us we cannot take any technology in the world and ho'o Hawaii and advance our own agenda, fight for our lands and our identity? Who could stop us from doing that? To me, nobody. And that's exactly what Lata Kapuaiwa folks did, was they took this tool that wasn't necessarily Hawaiian, but they Hawaiianized it. They made them Hawaii to preserve our lands and our national identities. Later on, my dad gonna join me, we're gonna play one song. It's a slack key song, right? The same metaphor goes, right? Did Hawaiians invent guitars? The answer is no, right? But when the Paniolo, when the Spanish and Mexican cowboys came here and they left the guitar behind, what did our people do? We took them, we went ho'o Hawaii, changed the tuning, find one way of playing it. No one else has played it like that in the whole world. And now it's ours, it's Hawaii. That's the same metaphor, yeah? That we can take and use new tools and make it Hawaiian to advance our own agenda. And that's exactly what Lata Kapuaiwa did. And he built off of the, you know, the incredible work of the Mahele. And many of us, we might have heard things about the Mahele. We're coming to understand the Mahele more and more over the last 30 years. At one point, you know, we thought the Mahele was actually the cause of the dispossession of Hawaiian lands, and we thought it was a foreign imposition. And some of my mentors, and who are now colleagues at the university, you know, kind of took up that stand. Over the last 10 to 15 years, as we've gotten deeper into the Hawaiian archive and resources, we're understanding that actually the Mahele was not an imposed system. It was a hybrid system. It was something that our kupuna also grabbed onto and preserved a whole bunch of traditional knowledge and land tenure system and relationships to land. And so I'm going to talk about some of those to you folks. If I was to ask by a show of hands, who has seen the first Kanawai of Hawaii, the first Hawaiian Constitution in 1840? Anybody seen them in Hawaiian language?
Like the original?
The original? Oh, no one knows where the original is, but a copy. A few? Okay, so maybe about less than a third of us, maybe. If I asked you in school, did you see the U.S. Constitution at some point in your life? Hands, please. Almost everybody's hands go up, right? And it turns out the Hawaiian Kingdom Constitution of 1840, amongst a bunch of other incredible things it did, what it did for land tenure was it defined that basically all of the lands, mai Hawaii a ni'ihau, are owned jointly by 3 classes, right? And it's owned by, first it says the mo'i, then it says the ali'i, so the chiefs that are under the mo'i, and then it says the Kānaka. Yeah. And this is really, really incredible. Like I said, born, raised, educated here on our islands, proud graduate of Kamehameha schools, Kapalama, when there was only one Kamehameha schools. Not a perfect institution, but getting better. But I never saw the Constitution of 1840 until I was in my late 20s doing research in the archives. And wouldn't it have made a difference that I knew that the first time our people wrote down our laws, and not even our laws, but codified the origin, the source of law for Hawaii, they said that they were going to preserve our traditional relationships to land, that all the land was going to be owned jointly by the king, the chiefs, and the people. Right? This is an incredible thing. It doesn't say anywhere in the U.S. Constitution all the lands are owned by the whites, you know, the Indians, and the slaves. Absolutely not. Who could hold landed property in the United States? White males. That's it. Right? Other people were excluded. And so the kingdom saw this opportunity to codify law, to preserve our traditional relationships to Aina. So even before the Mahele, how was the lands, was it owned? Jointly by 3 classes of people, like a trust, right? Not even owned, but the land owns us. We are a part of it, right? These are some of the relationships that they were trying to codify early on in the Constitution of 1840 and the Hawaiian Kingdom. And did you know that when they wrote this Constitution, it wasn't just, you know, some whatever, William Richard, somebody coming in and drafting it up and saying, hey, king, go accept this. No, actually, it was fiercely debated by the chiefs at the time. Kauikeoli, Kamehameha III, we know he establishes Boza Mahune to kind of draft some of this, and they debate and revise both the Constitution of 1840 and the laws of 1839 multiple times until it gets passed. So by establishing the Mahele in 1848, what they did was preserve all of the traditional place names. I teach a course in the law school. Some of my Shauna's here, as well as at the Center for Hawaiian Studies, on the Mahele and land tenure in Hawaii and doing legal research. But every semester, my students get to go into the archives and we actually see this Mahele book. Okay, what the Mahele was a chance for Kauikeoli to solidify all of the lands in Hawaii into one book. And he did them all by traditional place name. So if you go through the Book of Mahele, you can actually see the name of the island, the Ahupua'a, the Kalana, he calls it, which is kind of like the Makou, the big land division that the Ahupua'a sits in, the individual Aina, and then the chief that held it. It's an incredible resource that we have for us here. But it's another example and reason, really, why we still know our Ahupua'a and our traditional place names. Because the Mahele establishes land titles in Hawaii, and that means that all title in Hawaii has to go back to the Mahele, the original source of title. They could have done it any way they wanted. If the ali'i were greatly influenced by foreigners, for instance, they might have copied the New England system of land tenure, right? They might have copied the way Thomas Jefferson created a grid system across much of the center of the United States, but they did something different. They did something Hawaiian. They preserved our place names, and they also preserved those 3 classes of rights to land over time. So the ali'i and the mo'i exercise it out in the Mahele, and after that, all the land has this clause on them, and actually, if you come take a class with me, I can get into more detail. It's called Koi Na'e Ke Kuleana na Kānaka, and it says reserving the rights of the Kānaka, right, in land. So it comes from this Constitution of 1840, because the Hawaii Constitution said we all own the land together, these three classes. Okay, at 25 minutes in, I'm going to start again, so I don't want to go over, take anyone's time. All owned by these three classes, and now all the lands in Hawaii have this clause, Koi Na'e Ke Kuleana na Kānaka, that it's reserved for the rights of Hawaiian people. What I want to say is the intention of the mahele over time was that it would never end. The intention, I believe, of Kauikeoli was that every time a new Hawaiian was born, they had a right to land. They had a right to live someplace, right? To exercise their rights. People were not to be alienated from Aina. That was not the intention and the design of the mahele. The problems that we face in Hawaii today, many of them are around Aina, right? We no more land, right? Land's expensive. Many of those issues, to me, are more a result of the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom and the confiscation of our national lands, okay? So let me kind of transition into the mahele establishes all the lands in Hawaii. They're owned by these three classes. The chiefs hold on to some. The ali'i Kauikeoli holds on to some. As his own lands, they become the crown lands. He gives some to the government, that becomes the government lands. Fast forward to 1893. Our government is overthrown. The constitutional sovereign, Li'o protests diplomatically through international means and otherwise. Our people rise up to defeat 2 attempts at treaties of annexation. So in fact, we defeat any international treaty ceding Hawaiian territory to the United States at that point. But what happens is all of those lands, right, the crown and the government lands after the overthrow, the people that overthrew the government later call themselves the Republic of Hawaii, and they change the name of those lands. They don't call them the crown and the government. They don't talk about Kānaka's rights to those lands anymore. They do something that's it was fairly brilliant, incredibly devious, and it almost worked, but it didn't, because we're still here. They called them the public lands, okay? So they renamed them to sever the genealogy that Hawaiian people had to these land bases. You talk about Hawaiian Kingdom government and crown lands, anyone's going to realize, wait, something about Hawaiians in there. Something about Hawaiian rights to those lands, right? And so they reframed it and they called it the public lands. This was in 1895. From that period of 1895, actually less than 2 weeks after the overthrow, they start to sell off our national lands. And I did some research, and eventually I'm going to publish a book that has some of this information. And they start to sell off bits and pieces of our lands. They start to call it the public lands, and they even set up infrastructure systems to try to settle people from the American continent. And they're very specific. They want to settle. This is the words that come from Sanford Dole, so not from me. I can quote him. Go read it in my book. He says they did it to try to settle Anglo-Saxons in Hawaii. And so they set up these settlement societies and settlement associations to try to get people from the continent to come into Hawaii, to move in, to overwhelm our population. And now the lands are all called public lands. Okay, so they've tried to sever that genealogical connection that our people had to them. Right? And between 1893 and 1959, I don't have my sheet in front of me right now, but I tallied everything, and it's a little over 360,000 acres of land that was either sold or traded, taken from our people out of that land base. Okay. When 1959 happens, the so-called statehood vote, right? The U.S. government cedes the lands that it had already taken and held on to since 1898 and gives it to the state of Hawaii. These now, some people call them the ceded lands. Yeah, you'll see that phrase, the ceded lands, or you'll also see public lands. Today, if you read something probably from the Department of Land and Natural Resources, oftentimes they'll talk about their kuleana is to manage the public lands. So it's all inheriting this devious genealogy, right, of severing our people's connection to actually what is ours, our constitutionally vested rights to the Hawaiian Kingdom government and crown lands. Roughly between 1.8 million and 2 million acres in 1959 went from the federal government to be managed by the state of Hawaii, okay, that are roughly called the so-called ceded lands today. And these are mostly almost all of the lands that you'll find a public school on, University of Hawaii lands, Mauna Kea, places throughout all of Hawaii are a part of this land base. And it's a huge amount. All of Hawaii is about 4 million terrestrial acres. Yeah, so 1.8 million acres is almost half all the lands in Hawaii that, again, are a part of this genealogy of injustice, this incredible injustice that needs to be remedied, right? And is a large part and a large reason, I think, why many people are looking at Mauna Kea and saying, enough, right? 13 telescopes. These are our lands. How much more are we going to see? Enough. When are we going to have decision-making ability over our lands, right? How long we got to sit and offer testimony to boards that maybe don't even understand the complexity of this history? It's enough. It's lava. So the Aupua of Ka'ohe is a part of that land base that was taken from the Hawaiian people and now is managed, in part by the state of Hawaii, in part by Department of Hawaiian Homelands, in part by the University of Hawaii, but 100% whole, all of it, is a part of the lands that are ours, our people's lands. And what is amazing to me is here we are in 2019. The Mahele was in 1848. Okay, part of the strategy for the Mahele that Kauikeole laid out was, if a foreign government came in and tried to take over Hawaii, he didn't want them to be able to say, all this land is just Hawaiians, they don't own anything. We're gonna rename it. We're gonna call them New California, right? New California, New Mexico, whatever the name was gonna be. So he creates this land tenure system so that no matter what happened in the future, we would preserve our place names and have this constitutionally vested rights to our lands. He did that in 1848. The overthrow happened 15 years later. We're here in 2019. And the brilliance of that idea is still a big reason why we can understand where we are today, right? If there was no Mahele, we probably would have very little Hawaiian place names. If there was no Hawaiian Kingdom that established itself as an independent sovereign state in 1843, we would probably have very little Hawaiian place names in our islands, right? So what I'm getting at is, against incredible odds, against the biggest guns and warships of the time, at every step along the path, our people have stood up and risen into positions of leadership to fight for our aina. That is the most common story. That is Hawaiian, right? That is the most common thing that we do. Every song that we write, even if it's about a wahine, gotta talk about aina, right? Everything that we do is rooted to defending our homelands, our place, our kulaiwi. And so, if you couldn't predict the groundswell of people that would come here to Mauna Kea to defend our lands, I have to say, where the hell have you been? Who have you been listening to? Come and talk to the people. The brilliance of our kupuna still is that. I see these incredible Kānaka scholars that are a generation younger than me, and just like Kauikeoli, just like Lata Kapuaiwa, what are they doing? They're appropriating the tools and technologies of their time. They're blasting up Twitter. They created Kānaka Uber. All of these things, right? We never invent them, but guess what? We can use them. We can make them Hawaii. There's no one that can tell us, oh, we exist in this little box. This is what you gotta look. These are the tools you can play with. Absolutely not. It's all ours, right? To defend our aina, just like Kauikeoli and Lata Kapuaiwa did many, many years before us. And so I wanna take a moment and just mahalo each of you. Everyone volunteering our time, maybe taking time away from work, away from ohana, spending money to rent cars, to sleep in the backs of trucks, set up tents in the pahoihoi. When you thought you was gonna do that, right? To come here because something is happening, something special, something unique, a time when we can say, we've had enough. It's time to stand as a people. These are our lands. We know our history. We will not accept lies anymore, right? You guys inspire me. I was here on the first night when we came up from Ohaiula. I think had, I don't know, 10 trucks or something. And we marched around and we set up the puʻuhonua, and everyone was wondering what was going to happen. Will our people show up? Will our people come? There's thousands of us coming from all over Hawaii to be here together. Yeah. So you guys give me incredible pride. There's no law enforcement, no chains, no shackles that can stop the pride and truth in our heart. Win or lose, we've already won. I'm sorry for getting emotional. It's been a moving experience and time for me. And the other thing is we're all working together, whatever station you're at, right? People donating stuff, guys coming in, cleaning up the lua, professors at the university, lobbying the UH, their own institutions, all around the world. We're all working together. We don't even know who's leading it. Nobody's in charge. It's beautiful. It's amazing. Cannot stop this. As long as we, like Antipua is saying, you know, we stay with kapu aloha, right? That's our key, is kapu aloha. And the legacy and history of injustice that the world needs to hear and Hawaii needs to remedy. And so now I'm a father. I'm 41 years old. I'm getting fat. Actually, I'm losing a little bit of weight. I was fatter if you seen me 2 months ago. But I'm a father, and I raise my kids, you know, here in Waimea, in the malu of Mauna Kea. And I gotta say, you know, there's a lot of money and power involved in this. A lot of people, for a lot of time, had a hard time to speak out because of that. But all the gates are open now, and the truth is out. And those in power, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry. I'm celebrating where we are. And I think what I want to leave you folks with is just that. No matter what the urgency of the cause, no matter the David of Goliath odds against us, our people have decided for generations, for over a century, to mau the ea of the aina, to stand up for the sovereignty of the lands, of who we are as a people and our identity. And no matter what, even if we're scared, we don't know what's going to happen, right? We can draw upon that strength and that courage. We have an incredible archival record. Come take one of my classes at UH Manoa, bring it to the archives. Literally millions of documents written by our kupuna about our relationship to Aina, about our vested rights, about who we are as a people. You can read the letters between the ali'i and the kings and queens in Europe, right? If you read my book, you can hear the stories about how the ali'i went abroad and learned whatever they could from the outside world to come back to Hawaii, to protect us, to save us, to advance our national identity. This is the story of our people. Incredible resilience against all odds. Tiny little islands in the Pacific, fighting the most powerful economic and military force that the world has ever seen. And we here camping in trucks at the base of Puʻuhuluhulu. It's unreal. It's unreal. So proud. And being in the malu today of Mauna Kea and Puʻuhuluhulu, and I think I don't want to go over time, kind of running out of time. I wanted to offer you a more personal side and story and connection to Mauna Kea. My uncle and my dad are from Waimea. Grew up on my great-grandfather's ranch. In fact, we call him one ranch, but it's really one Quonset hut. One little metal can that my great-grandfather built for our family. And it's been a place of tremendous strength and rejuvenation. All the generations of our family go back there and stand together. And so many years ago, my uncle and my dad came up with this song. It's called The Beauty of Mauna Kea. And in fact, at that time there were no telescopes on Mauna Kea in 1969. But it's a very beautiful song. If I can get through it without crying, I'll be super proud of myself. But I'm really proud. My dad was able to come up today on the Mauna, and I think we're going to share this song together and kind of close our session. If anybody has questions for me, you can Beamer at hawaii.edu, come see me at UH. I'm pretty easy to find.
Still got him.
Still got him. But this is my dad, Kamana Beamer. How about a hand for my dad?
Aloha. I'd like to say I'm so proud of my son. And we're going to try not to get too emotional, but I went to Kamehameha in the early 70s, and there was minimal Hawaiian things going on. We had one Hawaiian class. I learned how to say, I have 2 pencils on my desk. A lua penikala on my pākauka. And I wrote a letter home to my mother about that. She was so proud of me. Now, in my mother's generation, she was at Kamehameha. She was expelled for getting up and doing the hula and Hawaiian chants. My grandfather, well, he was just a rowdy guy. And but his mother, Helen Deshay Beamer, wrote beautiful Hawaiian music and flourished in the early 1900s. Now, her generation, they had to take the hula underground. They weren't permitted to do it in public. My point is, Hawaii is a huge case of culture shock. And Kamana and his generation finally are bringing this to the fore. I'm so proud of them because they have so much more knowledge than we were ever taught, ever. More than my mother was ever taught. So we need to really mahalo them. How about a hand for Kamana? Like Kamana said, my brother and I grew up on my grandpa's ranch up in Waimea. It's a little towards Mauna Kea side of Lakeland. And we went to Waimea Elementary. And this song was born from those days. And I'd like to send a shout out to my brother Keola for writing this song. And glad it's in English because my Hawaiian is pretty bad. Whoa. Look out. friend and I would sometimes walk the trails of Mauna Kea. And in the evening we come home, see her standing there. The moon moves around when she sleeps. The clouds stand beside her when she weeps. And I could be forgotten and 1,000 miles away. Still I would recall the beauty of Mauna Kea. Now to any land you go, she will be with you if you love her like I do. Yeah. Now to any land you go, she will be with you if you love her like I do. Mauna Kea. And I live in the city now, and I see different things. And in the nights when I'm alone, she's in my dreams. The wind spins around when she winds. The sun spreads its warmth across her face. And I could be forgotten and 1,000 miles away. Still I would recall the beauty of Mauna Kea. Of Mauna Kea.
Eyo. Mahalo.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Puʻuhuluhulu University.